The 1980s is the perfect time for any types of anime, especially of those who are in its own experimental ways. Despite, though, that it's becoming the biggest things of how most of these titles, like most of them in general particularly, are becoming a household name during the 80s, which you know what I mean as well. As a matter of fact, besides the more popular title ones, like the ones that have become popular for the household name ones during the golden age of anime during the 80s, is a more commonly known thing is how, particularly of how, just to consider the fact of how it's becoming the most categorical things of how, just to consider how it's been giving on any of all sorts as well. But I'm talking about the anthology films, like the ones that are you're in for a treat as well. Particularly if you're into like anthology films, most of those like you want to rewatch, particularly like a collection on these short films that they were all hobbled together as they wanted to make as a feature film, particularly. And for this subject, this has to deal with under the topic involving robots, and that is Robot Carnival, a collection of 9 shorts done by 9 animators and 9 directors that put so much effort of how they made a lot of yen during the production of how they ever wanted to make an anthology film during the late 80s, particularly in general, particularly. Yeah, this is how it's given to the points of how they've combining all of it, most of them as well. So, with the one spectacular film for a animation event of the year as well. So, let's highlight this. So, our next one in this segment is the opening prologue sequence of how this takes place, how it starts off in a desert village, of how it's basically considered to the fact of how this basically its own little ways of how it's regarded, of how it's basically of how there was a village of people in the desert like this. When one villager recognizes the advert poster of the Robot Carnival, and he has to warn the villagers that it is coming, until it wasn't long until it destroys the village, like in its own destructive, like a machine kind of way. So that's the thing, though, as well. Franken's Gears, on the other hand, however, is basically a take on Frankenstein, which is a little more darker, and it's very serious of how a mad scientist wanted to create his robot back to life, of how he wants his creation to be coming back to life, of how it's very more given the fact there's no dialogue whatsoever. You just hear like these music of how like it's playing on synthesizers or electronic drums that you hear as well. Deprive, I mean, this is a little take of a viewer fare of how there's no dialogue again, and it's composed by the music score composer Joe Hisaishi as well, who recently worked on with Studio Ghibli, especially in most of the other ones, like Suddenly Not the Last other ones of its kind. So the story basically it takes place in a setting like where there's robots as well, and there's a robot who's kidnapping the girl who she's dating, her boyfriend, who is actually a robot, as well as the robot in the disguise of a human wants to give the chance of how he could rescue the girl of who he loved, particularly she's been kidnapped, and then he has to deal the battle conflict between this villain that looks like a 80s rejected Kiss member with a green hair, of how until he defeats the villain before he saves the girl, particularly of how he knows of how, and the girl is happy that that her boyfriend rescued her from evil, particularly. Okay, in the sequence, however, that's particularly given a little 80s formula for anime of how it's its own prominence of source as well. Presence, however, this story basically tells of how there's some dialogue on here whatsoever, and yes, this is basically of how he's basically has the android girl, particularly of how the solemn ways of how, particularly of how the true thing is particularly of how he wanted to basically how he has to interact, particularly of how just to consider how it's the longest segment, how he has basically has a meditation, memory, and regrets. When he creates a female robot android companion, when it rejects and it destroys her, particularly, but this wasn't long until he appears, and when years goes on, he becomes older, and then he becomes to be with the android robot companion one. And Starlight Angel, however, once again, there is no dialogue. You just hear like the music, particularly like the music on here. It kind of sounds like something which it predates Final Fantasy II video game as well, but there's some good music on there, like with the synthesizers and the drums on the electronic ones, particularly. Yeah, it's about the girl and her friend are at the amusement park, as how they were having fun, like in a Disneyland style amusement park, of how this has gotten to really exciting until she finds out that her friend is dating her boyfriend, the blonde-haired one, until she runs off into the other one, and into the other amusement ride on here, which it looks like a Space Mountain-like ride on here. So it drifts off to the part where she's flying on there with the robot person on the side, until the chaos of this other robot that starts the mayhem as well. And it turns out that it's actually her boyfriend with the brown hair as well. And this sequence on here is basically a take on a music video which is most significantly Aha's Take On Me music video. Yeah. What can I say? It's the 80s, particularly. Cloud, however, it just basically how it's a little animation of how it's speed-toned. It's basically tells about a childlike robot, of how it goes through the stormy weather from the humanity's birth until it's basically of its how foreground. And it's a little slow pacing though, of how until it grows to humanity's end, because it may be a little slow pacing of how Cloud sequence particularly on there, Yeah. It's basically of how I wanted to consider, well, technically of how it's a little slow pace, a little weakest in though, particularly. Yeah, it's like, it's a little very avant-garde for experimental influence, especially for an art house anthology film vibe to these days, too fond of its own ways considered, to the fact of how this basically, of how it's just how it is as well. Okay, and Strange Tale of the Meiji Era, which is basically a combination of mecha and the 16th century Japan. However, it's basically of how they're using tropes of classic period films from the Meiji Restoration with some super robot mecha action, particularly of how we see a pair of these robots made from bamboo where they duke it out with the crew, with how these locals are in these fast-talking mad scientist who is a foreigner. Okay, most of the characters in that one, they're like in the Japanese dub on here, they're speaking Japanese on here, but the foreign mad scientist character just barely speaks English as well, because he's voiced by an English voice actor, Henry T. Bowers, which is basically in the Japanese dub. Huh, it's very interesting. Yeah, because just because a character speaks English on here, you would see these Japanese kanji letter translations on here. And yes, this is directed by Hiroyuki Kitakubo, who has been later worked on fan favorites, like the later two works that he works later on, like the last two the Either as well. This makes it very unique and very of how the concept is very familiar, of how fast-paced, it can be very comedic, particularly of how this goes, particularly. And finally, Nightmare. This sequence in Nightmare, which is directed by Takashi Nakamura, I mean, this basically how it starts off, where it takes in the setting in Japan in modern day, until we see the nightfall coming, particularly. This basically of how the robots are causing among the carnage at night, particularly. Especially of how, if you ever seen images in Disney's Fantasia, especially the Night on Bald Mountain sequence that comes to everyone. Yeah, because this is basically anime's answer to Bald Mountain from Fantasia. It's a very interesting fact of how this is considered, of how, and not only you have the Night on Bald Mountain sequence inspiration, with a little twist to the Legend of Sleepy Hollow sequence from Disney's other film, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, as well. Yeah, basically, this story basically of how it takes in a cityscape instead of a bucolic scenes of nature in a village in Mount Triglav as well. But the city, basically how it gives it gives a lot of people that are robots when they cause the carnage as soon as the city slumbers as nighttime falls. The witness, who was a drunk salaryman, which wanted to escape the carnage as well. Well, this sequence, though, follows the same beats as Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Night on Bald Mountain altogether. This basically of how this is the most darkest sequence in this movie, particularly. And come to think of it, the animation's very interesting. It's a very Disney-esque style animation with the help of Takashi Nakamura. Yeah, because I like the sequence, in my opinion, though. I mean, this is very darker. The music is very a little mood and very 80s like pop music like vibe with the synthesizers and the such as well. Just to give it a little setting to the foreboding mood, particularly of what this sequence, how it goes. And the ending epilogue sequence in this basically have how it starts off, of how it's left off after the opening prologue sequence progresses, is how it basically just destroys by itself, particularly. I mean, this wasn't long until, boom, the end. This is how you finish this film, particularly. So for the production in Robot Carnival, particularly, as well, yeah, most of them have 9 sequences were directed by most directors on here, like Hiroshi Omori, Koji Morimoto, Mao Lando, Atsuko Fukushima, and Hiroyuki Kitakubo, Takashi Nakamura, and Katsuhiro Otomo, which Katsuhiro Otomo later worked on Neo Tokyo late in the same year and he's famously known for the most well-acclaimed popular film that made the phenomenon to anime, Akira, as well as subtly as the later works of either. Yeah, particularly on here, most of the sequences on there, like the sound, however, basically, like the opening sequence, the characters didn't know what they were saying in that one. Like, they were like goofy, high-pitched sounds. The sound effects they were used basically are from Hanna-Barbera, especially from the Hanna-Barbera sound effects library. You would expect hearing that in an anime as well. Well, most of the segments have no dialogue. For example, Cloud, Franken's Ears, Starlight Angel, and Nightmare. Those are the only 4 sequences that have no dialogue. There are some sequences that have the dialogue, like Presence and Strange, and what's that other sequence in that one that has the dialogue? I think that's probably The Strange Tale of the Meiji, which is restyled it as A Tale of Two Robots, which I think is in the Streamlined Pictures dub, of how basically how they wanted to make a lot of how the money in the production, particularly. Overall, basically, by all this means is that consider the fact of how Robot Carnival is becoming a treat for all the fans of anime, or to anyone who are fans of anthology films in general, particularly. It's basically how it's needless to say most simple stories want to come up to understand of how they absorb the challenge, of how just to stand out, of how just to never mirrors allow a new generation of how creative filmmakers wanted to make to inspire the future generations, particularly for most anime creators around the world. I mean, it is so different than any other film that hasn't been done before, which is basically a work of art. I mean, a couple of how I think this is one of the most hard-working things that they ever did during that period, particularly. for the idea for the film, like Robot Carnival. And it's particularly of how this is how it's partially how I got introduced to the fact of how it has been a long ways of how for creativities and imagination for the production of how they wanted to make an anthology film, especially for an anime as well. Well, technically though is that we have come abroad of this particularly of how most in the capital wills of how wanted to come to this as well. And for the thing is how with the help of the founder and producer who worked at the company called Another Push Pin Planning Company, a producer and founder named what's his name again? Probably like Kazufumi Nomura, after he started the career at the famed Mushi Productions that made numerous amounts of anime. Most significantly, a lot of them as either in general of its kind, particularly. But this has given the point for how what makes it interesting for Robot Carnival is particularly of how it was basically of how the anime industry rises, of how when they made most innovative companies of how they stumbled across upon the idea of how they want to work on something like this. And on top of this is how this wanted to become an animation event of the year as well. Streamline Pictures had dubbed this in English with the help of Carl Macek, as how he wanted to become a staple for English dubbed ones, particularly when the Robot Carnival was released on video. It was the first one given an English dub by Streamline Pictures, which in a sense is how, when it was only available on VHS and Laserdisc back in the 90s, as how what they had a lot to do particularly. And it's a very simple thing of how you want to give the points of how when the structures and the content of Robot Carnival were basically wanted to translate and present for the fans from all over the world, as how it just didn't seem to be how it became, how it's inspired for new waves of animators and directors from all around, everywhere, every day and all over the world. Time heals of how they made this film, particularly of how it was amazingly interesting as well. This movie was simply followed by more anthology films, what Katsuhiro Otomo later worked on, like most of them, like just to name something later on as well. And for the thing is, for overall, Robot Carnival is basically the first anime anthology film with the help from Katsuhiro Otomo, particularly, of how it's basically of how appropriate, of how the sensibility of how there's some newer generations of how daring, dauntlessly, of how the creative, of how they made their mark, as how just to consider the fact of how well true is, particularly like unlike most anthology films out there, well, just makes you wonder as how most of them, particularly, but I do appreciate, well, the best thing through I almost wanted to rewatch the sequence was Cloud, but I appreciate the dark sequences that are more like Frankenskiers and Nightmare, which I appreciate this as well, but I do enjoy the work of the design of Hiroyuki Kitazume's work in Starlight Angel, because he's famously known for his work on Sunrise, with his famous amount of anime. Like suddenly, like a bunch of the titles, either especially what comes to them as well. But I think this makes it different, though, for what Robot Carnival has given the facts of how it's becoming an example landmark of anthology anime films in general. For anime fans, anthology film fanatics, film critics, historians, everywhere. And this has it, thus being said, this is becoming the biggest example of anime anthology films. My score for it, and I really do love the music, though, because most of them on there like composed from the help of the work of Joe Hisashi, who recently worked at Studio Ghibli as well. And my score for this one, I'm going to give this a 10 out of 10. I considered basically of how this has given the seriously thing as well. And this conclusion, if you haven't seen this, give it a watch. I highly recommend you to check out this anthology film like Robot Carnival. Especially if you want to binge watch on something, highly recommend. If you have it on DVD or Blu-ray, because it's available from Discotheque Media as well, particularly as well. So that's going to be it for my redo review of Robot Carnival for today on Anime Retrospect. Thank you for watching, but before we go, here's what I'm saying for this video. Well, looking back on my previous review on Robot Carnival, I think I reviewed this once back in 2017, but I came back to revisiting as well, because, well, why not? Because I wanted to do something like, I have been rewatching this despite of how, 9 animators and directors made millions of yen when they wanted to make an anthology film of what they made as well, particularly for a film like Robot Carnival. Especially for it's almost to your typical parts of the golden age era of anime in the 20th century as well. Hope subscribe for content. My Anime Planet link in the description down below. You can share this video on your Twitter, Facebook, if you have Twitter and Facebook account, and all social media. Check out my Anime Planet link in the description down below. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. Be sure to smack the like button if you enjoy this video. Click on the subscribe button. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. If you haven't free, check out my channel. If you're new to my channel, smack the notifications bell button. Keep it otaku for this redo review. Until then, until next time, I'll be covering something to revisit, something as a treat for this. Till next time.